Good to see each one this evening. We're talking tonight. What's that? Yes, thank you. Some preachers love the darkness more than the light, you know. Helps the projector. Good to see each one. We're talking about the fossils this evening. I find that there are a lot of people who have been convinced by the evolutionists that the fossil record belongs to them, that this says evolution, and they just don't really like to talk about the fossils. And I'm here to tell you tonight that's not so. That's upside down and backwards. The fossils belong to us, and they provide powerful, strong, positive evidence for creation. And I think we can demonstrate that. But it certainly is critical evidence, the most critical evidence. If you're trying to prove evolution, how would you do it other than with the fossil record of those things that lived in the past? Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins University says it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. This is it. This is the ball game as far as evidence for evolution is concerned. He says only the fossil record provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. Lots of indirect evidence and inferences, but if you're going to prove it, direct evidence, it'd have to be here. Without it, it's an outrageous hypothesis. I want you to remember that statement. We'll come back to it because I think you'll see they are without it. But how do we look at the fossil record, a bunch of dead things and rocks, and distinguish between creation and evolution? Which one is served best by the evidence? Well, one of the ways would be to make predictions about what ought to be seen, and there are necessary predictions made, implied by both concepts. If we think about the idea of evolution, certainly the beginning would be different. Darwin would say there should be a simple, gradual, linked beginning, whereas the creationist says no, it ought to be abrupt and complex and diverse right from the start. As we progress upward, the evolutionist ought to find this allied continuum, things that are kin to each other, progressing upward, whereas with the creationist, we should see stasis, that is, stays the same, status quo, doesn't change, distinct and separate. And those are very distinct differences. Both would predict similarities, but for different reasons. The evolutionist would predict a branching pattern of similarities, like the nested tables. The creationist would predict similarities, like the artist who is producing the mosaic with a blue tile here where he needs it and a blue tile there where he needs it, but not necessarily connected. A mosaic pattern indicating a designer. Both see similarities, but a different arrangement. Now, I can tell you, our predictions are exactly what we expect. Theirs are not, but most people think, well, you're prejudiced. And so we're going to be allowing the antagonistic witness, the evolutionist, to describe the nature of the evidence. And sometimes people misunderstand. I'm quoting from evolutionists, not implying that they are creationists, but taking the antagonist and allowing him to define the nature of the evidence makes much stronger case. And so we're quoting from those who are devout believers. They're men of great faith, but in evolution. In court, if you have a friendly witness, that'll help, but then he's a friend. If you get the enemy to acknowledge the point that you're trying to make, contrary to their interest, then that's 10 times the weight as far as evidence is concerned. Well, let's begin with one of these antagonists, Richard Dawkins, perhaps the best known in the world, from Cambridge and Oxford. He's talking about what's at the bottom of the geologic column, this record as they arrange it, that's supposed to represent evolution. What do we find at the bottom? Well, as we saw, the predictions are very much in contrast. But he acknowledges we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. Now, wait a minute. Here's the beginning. How do you know it's a state of evolution if, boom, there it is, right at the start? The first time it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. But he has evolutionary faith in spite of the fact it's without the history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist, and I'll plead guilty. That means that's exactly what I predicted, and that's what he acknowledges is the case. And so the beginning, according to this antagonist, is exactly what we predict. National Geographic is certainly not a friend to creationists. But here's their description of the beginning, that lowest layer of the geologic column, the Cambrian period. It's an explosion of life. It's not the slow, gradual beginning, simple to more complex later, but this is boom, right at the start. Notice the description by Stephen Gould of Harvard, wrote for 30 years for natural history and one of the better known paleontologists in the world. The Cambrian, that's that lowest layer, explosion occurred at a geological moment, and all the major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Now here's the bottom, and boom, there's all of the anatomical designs. He didn't believe that word, but he used it because it looks that way. But it's an evolutionary appearance. Now, wait a minute. Evolution says it's a gradual. No, it's not. Boom, it's exploded, and all of them are there right from the start. Not only the phylum Chordata, that's the major biological category that includes animals with backbones, ourselves. Not only the phylum Chordata, but also its major divisions right at the start. Now, these trees of evolution have man up at the top, but no, here's Chordata down at the bottom, all of its major divisions, contrary to Darwin's expectations. Now, he said it for me. Their record doesn't fit their predictions. It's not their record, it's our record. It does fit our predictions. But then it gets worse, as he describes it. Since the so-called Cambrian Explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. Boom, you got them all, and no new ones since. Now what does that sound like? Doesn't sound like evolution, does it? No. Maxwell Maltz, University of Texas, Austin, fairly recently said the Cambrian Explosion, it wasn't, now the Cambrian again, this is the lowest layer, according to their definition. It wasn't a gradual development of complexity. Now that's what they predict. It wasn't, Maltz said. Things suddenly seemed to burst out of a magic box. Now he's not a creationist, but he sounds like one. He's just describing what we see. So the beginning here in a more recent quote, 2012, in the journal Evolutionary Biology, fossils from the Cambrian period cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. Now you can understand that from the descriptions we've just looked at. This is not what they predict. The opposite. It's exactly what we predict. A real headache for evolutionary biologists. We expect simple organisms evolving over time to become increasingly more complex. That's their prediction. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of different major groups of animals all appearing simultaneously in the fossil record when we first encounter them in the Cambrian record. Now, if I was writing something to describe creation, I don't think I could have done a better job. But here's the antagonist who is acknowledging exactly what the predictions are for the creationist, and that they are not what the evolutionist predicts. We can summarize it this way: when we're talking about this lowest layer, the Cambrian, it burst out of a magic box. They're complex. They appear suddenly right at the start. A real headache for evolutionary biologists. They're advanced, just planted without any evolutionary history. All the major anatomical designs, the chordata, its major divisions, and no new ones since. Now, I couldn't have written that any better myself. I didn't. This was from the antagonistic witness who acknowledges, contrary to his interest, exactly what the facts are. They're right. That is what the facts are. We agree because that's what the evidence is, which they don't want to acknowledge but do. In spite of that description, you find this in the textbooks that says, here's this slow, simple beginning, gradually working up to man at the top. Now, if you turn that upside down, with all the major types represented here at the top, that's the way it is at the bottom. They've got the tree upside down, and it has deteriorated. We've got fewer kinds. We're supposed to be losing a species a month, according to some of these conservationists, and it doesn't sound like evolution to me, but that's their description. The trees are described here by Gould of Harvard. He says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. Trunk is not there. The big limbs are not. It's right out on the ends. You've got some data. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. And it's upside down, which he goes on to say in his book, The Wonderful Life, and we just went past some of that. Okay. In his book, The Wonderful Life, he talks about the cone of diversity, gradually becoming more and more complex. This is what's predicted. But notice what he says about it. With this illustration in the book, he says they've turned the traditional interpretation on its head. They have inverted the cone. Now, this is our cone. The other one is their cone. And the evolutionist is saying, well, it's not what we predicted. But that's what they put in the textbooks, just like this, the opposite of what they acknowledge to be the truth. Well, how in the world do you come up with this kind of representation, which is opposite to what you find in the fossil record? Well, they arrange it that way, as they acknowledge here in the textbook Evolution to the Earth. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way with the simplest forms first. Does that sound familiar? You were here last night. In terms of the column, now then in terms of the fossils, that's the way they arrange. Now that's somewhat oversimplified, but that's their statement. Progressively more complex groups following. The particular arrangement is arbitrary. That is, it's not what you find in the fossils. Now, to be fair, there is a methodology. There is a way that they arrange this. It's not the fossils. It's not the way you find the fossils in the record. It is because they are related, stated here on the same page. The less they look alike, the further removed they are from their common ancestor. So it's all about similarities. And see, this is similar and it must be kin. Fairly reasonable. You look at cousins and brothers and sisters, you can see some similarity. And when you look at the animal world, you can see some very obvious similarities. They're obvious contrast, but the similarity is very dramatic. Now, the question is not whether, but why. The evolutionist doesn't ask that question. he will tell you it's because they're kin. Maybe there's another explanation. We see similarity like this when we drive down a subdivision, and why are these houses alike? Because they're cousins. No, because they had a common designer, didn't they? And we expect that with a common designer. If you ask the question, then that's a pretty obvious answer here. And when we see similarities in design in the living world, which is supposed to be proof of evolution, not fossil record, but just the similarities that you see in the, well, yeah, the frog, this pendactyl form of the vertebrate hand is very similar with the rabbit and the lizard, the bird. And why is that? Well, there are at least two possible explanations, aren't there? A common designer would use similar forms for similar functions, and common genetics would produce this, two possibilities of this. Now, which one is a better explanation? If it's just as good, then we don't really have an advantage in either case, but I don't think that's the case. Genetics has difficulty explaining this, especially when you go to embryology. We see the newt hand from segments 2 through 5 in the embryo. The lizard hand is from segments 6 through 9. They have similar forms, but they come from different parts of the embryo. The man's hand is from segments 13 through 18. Again, different parts. They're not common genetics. Common form, looking, shape, design, but the genes are different. Sir Gavin de Beer, professor of embryology at Oxford and director at the time he wrote this of the British Museum of Natural History, comments on this. He says the attempt to find homologous genes, homology is these similarities that they arrange to look like what we see on the illustration. That's homology, the argument from it that Darwin made. But homologous genes, he says, has been given up as hopeless, because if they came from a common ancestor, there ought to be common genes here, but they are not. They have given up as hopeless, so we've got one explanation that works better. But this is what we're looking at when we see the textbooks. Similarities. Not on all similarities. Some of them, ignoring those that don't work, and there are many that don't. One claim based on similarities that you've probably heard involves the similarity between the chimpanzee and the man. Richard Dawkins says chimpanzees and we share more than 99% of our genes. Have you heard that? Richard Dawkins made a very similar statement in his Blind Watchmaker 34 years ago, a very outdated claim now. We share more than 99% of our genes with the chimpanzees. Bill Nye, the science guy, when he was debating Ken Ham, says we share around 98% of our genes with the chimpanzees. And that was 2014. Well, they're all way behind the times. That was a rough estimate. It was a poor scientific estimate to start with. But here from Science, the leading science journal in our country, back in 2007, or 2007, relative differences, the myth of 1%. That's the headlines of the article, the myth of this 1% difference. Studies are showing that humans and chimps are not as similar as many tend to believe. Chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, the very structure of chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. There's no way you can say 10%, 20%, 1%. It just confounds any quantification. They're just different. In Nature here in 2010, they continue to report on the findings. Comparisons now reveal they differ radically in sequence structure, in gene content. The chimpanzee genome is 10 to 20% longer. Well, that doesn't sound like a 1% difference, does it? 50% of the human genes were missing from the chimp, but they still say 1% difference. 1/3 more gene categories, entirely different classes of genes. So if somebody's telling you there's just 1% difference, and you'll hear that if you talk to many evolutionists, they're either ignorant or they're not telling the truth. That's way out of date and wasn't good to start with. One illustration of the era that we're seeing here, looking at similarities, choosing only the similarities that fit your view to illustrate your point, is really bad science. And they're very selective when they choose the similarities. We look, for example, at the number of chromosomes, and we see an order. Humans at the top, 46, and the bat, the alligator, down to penicillium at 2. Okay, that looks like an evolutionary sequence, right? But what messes that up is when you see the rest of the story, which they've left out. The sweet potato got twice as many as we have. The turkey does as well. The fern has 480. But they leave all of that out, and boy, that just really messes up the picture, doesn't it? If you select the similarities, you can make it say whatever you want to. But there are similarities, yes. For example, we share half our genes with a banana. That describes some of the people I know. Bananas, I guess, maybe fit. We share 63% of our genes with the fruit fly. All of that is, I think, due to a common designer, and it fits that view better. But when you look at similarities, you need to understand they're being very selective. We're looking here at similarities. They look similar, right? These two fish. And if you nodded your head, I caught you, because neither one of them are fish. One's a reptile, the other's a mammal. They're not kin at all, not related, but they're similar. Well, you just don't count that. Similarities indicate common ancestry, except when they don't. And there's a lot of don'ts around. Let me give you some more illustrations of that. When you're looking at man's relatives in terms of similarity, they always refer us to the blood serum. And yes, that's very similar to the chimpanzee, and if the right anti-serum is used, you can actually utilize blood serum from a chimpanzee in humans. It's similar. But that's not the consistent total picture. When you look at milk chemistry, the closest relative is not the ape or the monkey, it is the donkey. Well, maybe for some folks that makes sense, but not what they're predicting in terms of milk chemistry. The donkey, and there are others that are similar, much more so than the apes, and some of them you would not expect at all. The cockroach. Here's the article from Science News, 2016, Got Milk? Roach milk could be a new superfood. Cockroach milk is among the most nutritious substances on Earth, 3 times richer in calories than buffalo milk, the previous top contender for the most protein and calorie-rich milk. Well, that's not what they predict. In terms of cholesterol, we're all concerned about that. Our closest relative is the garter snake, which has cholesterol just like we do and has problems like we do. Teeth, this is a very important factor in the fossil record. They preserve well and very helpful in identification. Ape teeth look like human teeth? Well, not really. It is like fish teeth. Have you seen the sheep's head? Some of you may be a little envious looking at some. The ape teeth, that's not the same. But the sheep's head, Man, those are some nice-looking chompers, aren't they? And the parrotfish. Wow, that looks pretty good. Not the ape. The ape has different teeth. In terms of foot structure, which we're interested in, we talked about last night down at Glen Rose, some will say, well, maybe they're ape feet. Well, the ape has a hand for a foot. Doesn't look like a human foot, and of course, if you got apes with dinosaurs, that would be a similar challenge. But they're not the same. The closest relative is the glacial bear, that is to humans. His foot structure is almost identical. Of course, he's a quadruped and has claws. But you look at the skeleton, if you remove the claws at the end, that skeleton is just a dead ringer for our foot, not the ape. In terms of tear enzyme, the lysosome is a little enzyme that just runs around eating like Pac-Man, eating the bacteria. And the chicken needs it, producing eggs as it does. We need it in our eyes, and we've got the same blue tile here, blue tile there, where it's needed, but not from the ape, from the chicken. Lysosome is also found in the worms, the nematodes. I don't know how that fits into an evolutionary picture at all. Blood antigen A, our closest relative is the butterbean. You see the point? It's a mosaic pattern. It's not a branching pattern. In terms of brain hormone, you're not going to believe this. Here he comes again. It's the cockroach. Notice the article from Discover magazine, don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin. Cockroach and man, it seems, share not a similar, but a common brain hormone. Now that's not simple. Very complex arrangement of amino acids and enzymes to produce a brain hormone, and it's exactly the same in the cockroach. Exactly the same. Yeah, sorry, that's the picture. So what we're looking at is that mosaic pattern of similarity that the creationists predict, but it's not the branching pattern that the evolutionists predict. Very much in contrast to it. So, summarizing then the picture of the fossil beginning, it is complex and diverse and abrupt right from the start with no new final since. Boom, an explosion. There's all the kinds and no new one since then. The trees are from selected similarities, very selective, ignoring much of that which would contradict. It's not from the fossils, certainly not from embryology, not from genetics. It's upside down in terms of what we find in the record. The similarities are definitely a mosaic pattern. And so when we look at the beginning of that fossil record, that's just exactly what we would predict. It favors creation. Now, as we move up the record and look at the rest of the fossil record, transitional forms are supposed to be that which documents going from one kind to another kind. How would you show from the fossil record evolution? Well, you got to show one kind going to another kind. Transitional forms are necessary. They don't find them. Darwin acknowledged this is the biggest problem he had. Reading here from Origin of the Species, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. That's how we got here. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological formation, every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such graduated organic chain. This is perhaps the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, a lot of people think he was convinced by the fossil record. He said exactly the opposite. Fossil record's the biggest problem he had, because there ought to be transitional forms. There were not. His prediction was that with further collecting, they would be filled in. Not so. Here's David Rapp of the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, curator of the largest fossil museum in the United States. He says, we are now 120 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, has to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Did you know it had been discarded? You don't have this horse evolution anymore. It's still in the textbooks. But here's the leading expert telling us, no, that picture in the textbook that virtually everybody has seen is not true. One of the problems is they leave things out, like the donkey that we excavated near Lubbock, Texas, Ascentius gigantus, 9 feet tall at the shoulder. A donkey that's 6 feet tall at the shoulder is big today. 9 feet, you haven't seen one. But that's what that kind of messes up the picture. But they begin with Eohippus, or Hydrocatherium, the fancy word. That's what it was given as the first name by Richard Owen back in 1840 when the fossil was first found. No connection with a horse at all. Does that look like a horse? No, it looks like a hyrax, and that's what the name means, Hydrocatherium. It's like a hyrax. But now then, they need something up there leading to the horse, so that's where they put it. Here from 2016, from the Natural History Museum at Oxford, the evolution of the modern horse can be traced back to the Eocene. Here's the first horse, Hydrocatherium, like a hyrax. Well, this is a hyrax. He's a little critter about like this. It really looks like a horse, or does he? I don't know. Maybe you could put a saddle on him. But this doesn't look like a horse. But that's what they've got as the first representative of horse evolution. Some of them are not that convinced, as we might imagine. Even Wikipedia says hyrax is sometimes described as being the closest relative of the elephant. Yeah, I can see that, or can you? I don't think that looks much like an elephant. They're trying, very. But this is the picture and the way it begins. Now, the rest of them, we'll see horses with 2 toes, sometimes 1, sometimes 3. The thing that really blows that picture out of the water is what we find at northeastern Nebraska, the ashfall fossil beds, where all of those representatives, with the exception of the first one, which doesn't belong with the horses anyway, are found side by side, covered with the same ashfall. All 5 species together in the same place. Another so-called transition that is promoted in the textbooks is Archaeopteryx. He's got feathers, he's got teeth. Okay, he must be primitive. Bird with teeth. That means he's primitive. Did you know that's what your teeth represented? We find amphibians with teeth and amphibians without teeth. And we find reptiles with teeth and some without. We find some birds with teeth and some without. Probably some of you have teeth and some without. I don't think that proves evolution or one more primitive. This is a good bird. He has beautiful, powered, flying wings. He does have claws on the end, as do some modern birds today. The Hoatzin down in South America has claws on the wing, certainly in the juvenile form, and that's what we have found. All of the fossils have been juvenile forms. But they grew up to look kind of like pheasants or chickens. They're perfectly modern birds. So what's the challenge here? I think the thing that really blows it out of the water is a discovery that was made at Texas Tech not too long ago. In fact, I was working with Dr. Chatterjee shortly after this. He's reporting in Nature the fossil remains of two crow-sized birds 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Now that's half again as old. Older. Now Archaeopteryx is what's supposed to have led to the bird, from the reptiles to the birds, in between, intermediate. But here's a bird before you get there. Half again as old as Archaeopteryx, who's supposed to have been the grandparents that followed, or in between. And the paleontologist Texas Tech found fossils, said they have advanced avian features way before Archaeopteryx, and even before the dinosaurs. So here's a perfectly modern bird, but you're supposed to have dinosaurs leading to the reptiles that lead to the birds. Nope, that's not the way they do it, according to their dating methods. Whales have been a challenge to the evolutionists, and they've responded trying to answer that. They evolved out of the ocean up onto the land and then turned around and evolved back into the ocean. And some of you ladies know something about mammary glands and nursing. You try to imagine that underwater. How is the baby going to do that? That's not going to work. Well, the whale does it really well, and he did it that way to begin with, or he wouldn't be here when he got back to the ocean. But here we are told that there's a four-legged whale. This was from National Public Radio, from Newsweek, New York Post, BBC. Just look at the quotes from those sources here. The National Public Radio: scientists discover fossils of a four-legged whale. That's 2021. And then Newsweek: scientists have found fossils of a deadly four-legged whale. Wow. Okay. Deadly whale. And then New York Post: fossils previously unknown four-legged whale found in the New York Post. And then BBC: new species of ancient four-legged whale discovered. Now that would be interesting. What did it look like? There it is. You see the four legs? No, but that's it in total. Now, when it was reported in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, it was like this. Now, the red part is what they found. Take away the rest, and there's your four-legged whale. You have four legs, four flippers. Who knows? Related to whales? Nothing to do with whales? There's no way to tell that. It's impossible to know. But they're really hurting for something there, and so that's what you hear in the headlines. Sometimes you need to look at the facts. Stephen Stanley is, I think, more honest than many of them. He just says this, and he's a devout evolutionist, wrote books with Stephen Gould. In fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition of one species to another. Not one. And there's nobody that knows more about it than he does, more representative. Interestingly, his partner, Stephen Gould, again, very famous paleontologist of Harvard, finally, before he died, 2002, published his tome, his huge volume, representing the summation of his life's work, the structure of evolutionary theory. And the theme of it, I would say, is stasis. That's what he acknowledges as the picture of the fossil record. Stasis, according to Wikipedia, little or no evolutionary change in the species. It stay the same, status quo, no evolution. Notice what he says about it. Spread over millions of years, no net change, with beginning and end points substantially the same. Now that's stasis. He says stasis existed in overwhelming abundance, as every paleontologist always knew. It is the most common pattern in the fossil record. It is the primary signal of the fossil record. Now, no change is the primary signal. Stasis, the most common pattern. And they all knew it. He says Darwin's expectations defined evolution as gradual change. In this context, stasis can only record sorrow and disappointment. Not for the creationist, but for the evolutionist who are not meeting their predictions. He says it is an empirical signal of quite stunning contrariness. Empirical falsification. Now those are heavy words that just say, ball game's over. Though he didn't give up. He said he had ways to try to explain that away, but that's the nature of the record. Well, that was 2002. Surely we've learned more since then? No, it's gotten worse. Donald Prothero is probably the one who is now taking his place. He's author of 6 geology textbooks, professor of geology at California Institute of Technology. I think he would be the most representative, and he says many paleontologists came forward, referring to Google actually, pointed out that the geological literature was one vast monument to stasis. Yep. With relatively few cases where anyone had ever observed gradual evolution. That's exactly what, I grin they don't. As Gould put it, it was the dirty little secret hidden in the paleontological closet. And that is still the consensus 40 years later, 2015. Now, that's saying the fossils are ours. It stays the same. That's what we would predict. It is a vast monument to stasis. Evolution says no. But this is the most common pattern, the primary signal, the consensus, according to the leading authority in geology today. On the other hand, you've got transitions, do you? Well, a few cases, maybe not one, others say. That's pretty light evidence, isn't it, as opposed to the monument to stasis. So how do they respond to that? They just respond with blind faith in many instances. A.C. Stewart of Cambridge is talking about the plant record, which is his field. The theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp. Our faith postulates its existence, but the type fails to materialize. That's a very honest statement, but that's a very revealing statement. To show an illustration of that, here's a professor of geology at Lamar University that I debated when I was there, and he started out holding up a book of fossils. He said, evolution is an absolute fact. Arguing from the absence of transitional fossils is crazy. All fossils are transitional. I mean, you have faith that they got here by evolution, then yeah, they all have to be transitional. But where is the example? None that he could point to, but he just has faith. They're all transitional. As one person said regarding the faith of the evolutionist, it's the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. This is the blind faith, which is very different from the evidence that we can depend on. Let me move forward here and summarize the evidence this way. Darwin's biggest problem, it's worse now, embarrassed is their description. It's been debunked, it's a headache, but the blind faith still believes. On the other hand, it delights the creationist, this is their term. It's as just planted, advanced right from the start, an explosion, like a magic box, and mosaic similarities, not branching pattern. It's a monument to stasis. Now, when you weigh that description from the antagonistic witness themselves, then you have exactly what Stanley told us. It's an outrageous hypothesis. They don't have the fossils. The fossils testify against them. And so I will affirm that the fossil record favors creation. Now, let's move quickly to the second stanza of this song, same song, the fossil record regarding men. And it's important to, and I've not spent as much time as I should have, I think. I've learned this is what convinces most, in fact, a survey recently indicated from students who had changed their mind from creation to evolution. Why did they do that? 80% of them said because of the evidence from fossil men. And it's just not true. It's not telling the truth. Let's begin by looking at a statement by Roger Lewin, who was editor of Science News and Science Magazine. He says the key issue, here's the crux of the matter as far as fossil men are concerned. The key issue is the ability to correctly infer genetic relationship between two species on the basis of similarity in appearance. This one looks similar to that one. Okay, maybe not so much, and they argue a bunch about it. He goes on to say that similarity is deceptive because similarity does not necessarily imply identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, a porpoise, which is a mammal, for example, is similar but not kin. We talked about that earlier. But now here is what's normally taught in the textbooks. This is the standard ladder, Australopithecus, the ape man, leading up to modern man. Notice the statement by Henry Glee. He's senior editor of Nature. Nature, the most authoritative science journal in the world. Evolutionist, paleontologist, biologist. No fossil is buried with its birth certificate. Did you know that? Take a line of fossils, claim that they represent a lineage. That's not a scientific hypothesis. It can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps, instructive, but not scientific. Now, you see the lineup, and it's impressive to some, but it's not scientific. And what they're showing you is the lineup they have selected, the similarities that they have picked out. And I can illustrate the deceptive nature of that by this picture, which everybody recognizes, very famous, one of the most famous pictures in the world. Everybody, well, yeah, you probably recognize it. This is the rest of the story, but what you were looking at was right here. Now that's real, but it didn't look like the whole picture, did it? When you see the rest of the story, things look different. We look at that lineup, but they leave out this critter, the extinct ape directly linked to the living orangutan, finally published 2019, Gigantopithecus, almost 10 feet tall, over 1,000 pounds, close to the orangutan. It was discovered in 1935. I actually had been talking about it since, for about 40 years. I found it at Vanderbilt. But that just really messes up the picture, doesn't it? Here's Australopithecus, which is at 3 million years and then 9 million years. According to them, you've got Gigantopithecus. So that comes first. But he doesn't fit that picture, so they just leave him out. This is the way it starts. Now, Australopithecus is a very interesting creature, and I'm going to let David Minton describe him to you. David Minton was a professor here at Washington University. He's one of the best-known anatomists in the world. Any medical textbook's going to have a number of articles by him. But let's hear what he has to say about things that he's observed about.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova?
Obviously is a creationist, by the way.
There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoya Footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job. But after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect! You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
since that discovery that they operated on, 11 more specimens have been found. They all needed hip surgery. Notice the comments by Zillman, who was a famous paleoanthropologist, University of California, Santa Clara. They're almost identical to the pygmy chimp. Body size, stature, brain size indicates that their use the limbs the same way. She thinks they're like the pygmy, which sometimes walks upright. But what does walking upright mean? There's an interesting article about a monkey that got sick. Workers say that that's when she started walking upright exclusively, came down with a form of the flu. The zoo veterinarian says he's not sure why she's altered her behavior, but just exclusively walked upright from that point, speculating that the illness could have caused brain damage. So maybe that's why we walk upright. But there's certainly a lot of animals that do, like the pygmy chimp. Some chickens walk upright and dance and keep up with the music. Anteaters stand upright. Here we got prairie dogs. We got lizards that stand upright. Some of them walk upright as well enough to run across the surface of the water, and some of them have learned to sell insurance. But I'm not sure that proves anything. Australopithecus was a critter that walked like an ape and had a brain like an ape and teeth like an ape, like the Galata baboon, face like an ape, arms like an ape, hands and legs like an ape, and feet and toes. What do you think that was? Must have been a duck. Australopithecus is an ape. This doesn't challenge our faith. The next rung of the ladder is Homo erectus, and we don't have time to look at all of the examples. I'll just go to the summary slide. The Java man is one example. Used to be 500 million years old. It's now 27,000. We learned better. It's called now Homo sapien, not Homo erectus, but that's in the textbook as Homo erectus often. Turkana boy looks just like us, huge, large, unnoticed. The 9-year-old specimen was 5'6". The average 9-year-old today is 4'6". This was a large modern specimen. Latoya Footprints, according to Mary Leakey, was normal human footprints not unlike our own, she said. Canopy man, according to Oxnard, who was dean of the grad school at University of Southern California, says it was absolutely indistinguishable from modern, even with multivariate analysis, where they take each bone and measure it about 1,000 different ways and put it in the computer, and it's not, yeah, it looks similar or it doesn't. It's the computer saying, yeah, it's exactly indistinguishable. That's a man. These are pieces, but they're trying to make them something else. Wish we had more time to, and you do have all the documentation of these quotes in the handout, by the way. We move from there to Neanderthal. Now, that critter looks pretty primitive. Notice the statement by Ian Tattersall, who's head of the Department of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. Now, that's a pretty heavy authority. He says the recognition finally that the stoop-shouldered, bent-kneed stereotype of these humans created by Marcellin Buell, he's the one that was responsible for this representation, is totally false. Now, that's in the books, but it's not so. Trickus is a professor at Washington University. Notice the website, they're kind of bragging on him, but I think they're right. Trickus is considered by many to be the world's most influential scholar of Neanderthal biology and evolution. I think that's right, and he's here at Washington University. In Science, Live Science, he said, he's quoted saying he's not seen evidence of any kind of difference, biological or social. And then ABC acknowledged the image of Neanderthals may need a makeover. Scientists say at least some of these extinct hominids could have had fair skin and red hair, and some of the DNA indicates that. Okay, if you put fair skin and red hair over this skeleton, Julianne Moore may not appreciate that, but it fits just perfectly. Fair skin, red hair is not the way you see it in the textbook typically, though with this finding, National Geographic tried to do this, but they didn't have the cosmetics or the well-coiffed hair. This is Wilma, and that's pretty scary, but I guess red hair. They did find that Neanderthal used makeup, here reported in BBC. The first secure evidence for their use of cosmetics, to me it's the smoking gun that kills the argument once and for all, that buries the view of Neanderthals as half-wits. We'll summarize quickly this way. Richard Leakey says they are unquestionably Homo sapien, that's us. Ridiculous reconstruction, hunched over, the ankle bones were on backwards. Howell said he should have fallen on his face. We do find modern skeletons actually below Neanderthal skeletons on Mount Carmel in Israel. It's an interesting story. Perfectly human language, we have that documented in the handouts. Significantly larger brain than we have. Ours averages about 1440 cc's. This was averaging about 1600 cc's. Same proteins as ours. Can sequence those and compare them. They are identical. We have overlapping DNA. Did you know some of the people in here had Neanderthal DNA? About 70% of them do. They buried their dead with religious ceremony. They played music with the same do-re-mi scale that we do. They used the cosmetics, actually used aspirin and penicillin, and were seafaring. I don't think there's anything primitive about that, but we've been misled about it. Men, and apes. Yeah. Where's the challenge? That's what we predict. Bernard Wood, professor of human origin, George Washington, summarizes the picture. This is the truth. A succession of figures has become ever more human. Progression from ape to human looks so smooth and so tidy, such a beguiling image, even the experts are loath to let go, but it is an illusion. He says, let's see if we've got the other quote here, even with all the fossil evidence from the past 50 years, convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. He's probably the leading expert in all of human evolution. And he says, we haven't found the evidence. It looks tidy, but it's not. It's an illusion. And let me summarize it quickly this way, and we'll conclude with this illustration. You go to the ape barn and you see a variety of apes. Our Creator loves variety. You look in the world today and you see a variety of human beings. Doesn't surprise us. And from our own prejudicial perspective, some of us may look a little strange, but we're good humans. Now, that's what you see in the fossil record. That's what you see in the living world. And that does not challenge our faith at all. That's our picture. Now, they try hard to put something in between. It's either apes or men, or as Dwayne Gish used to say, you take a little incus opus and a little hocus pocus and come up with Pithecus spoofus. But the record of fossil man, I think, favors creation, as does the entire fossil record. Thank you very much for your attention. I think our time is up, isn't it?